So the importance of holding today's event, the discussion that we're about to take part in, to enjoy, about the relevance of Lenin 100 years after his death, will be outlined by the speakers after me. I want to just make a couple of remarks before I introduce them. There is a long and important connection between British and Russian Marxism. Lenin is really the center of that connection, the highest point at which that connection found itself. The connection goes back to before Lenin came to London, the immigration to London of Theodor Rothstein, a Tsarist civil servant who fled from Russia, came to London as a Marxist, was a journalist, a member of the Social Democratic Federation, the first so-called Marxist party in Britain. And it was Rothstein who introduced Lenin to this building, we believe, when he came to London in 1902 with Nadezhda Krupskaya. So the connections that were political and personal went from London, from Little Russia near King's Cross, where Lenin first lived when he came to London, all the way back to Moscow, and continued throughout the 20th century. The exhibition upstairs in our reading room today shows you the numbers of Soviet visitors coming to this building in order to honor the role that Lenin played in London, in here, in editing the newspaper Iskra, The Spark. And the speakers that we have today are going to be teasing out the connections between Lenin, this city, this building, the collection that we have here, and the continuing work that we do in terms of teaching the ideas of Lenin, which were the ideas of Marx. So it gives me great pleasure, therefore, first of all, to introduce this morning's session, which we could call a more biographical approach to Lenin. This afternoon, we'll be looking at a political approach to the work of Lenin. This morning's speakers will be firstly on my right, your left, Marion Jump, our director at the library, who will be talking about Lenin and this building, the relationship with 37 Clerkenwell Green, an incredible history. Following on from Marion, we'll be hearing from Dr. Robert Henderson, Bob Henderson, former neighbour of mine, a real, I'd have to say, a COVID find. You make connections with people in your neighbourhood during COVID, during lockdown, and I made a connection with him, which was very, very fortuitous, because he is the former curator of the Russian collection at the British Museum. And for that reason, he's got something of particular relevance to contribute to this discussion. He's also the author of Lenin in London, The Spark That Lit the Revolution, which talks about the particular relevance of Lenin in this city to the subsequent events that dominated the 20th century and still dominate our century today. After Marion and Bob have made their contributions, which will be in the order of about 20 to 25 minutes each, we'll have questions, discussions. You can contribute from the floor, and people online, if you would be so kind as to put your questions into the chat, we will be reading out the questions in the chat. So that'll take us through to lunch. We'll be having lunch at about 12:15, and lunch will last from 12:15 to 1:30. This afternoon's sessions are about Lenin's thoughts, his ideas, his theory, his writing, and it will commence with, after lunch, first of all, Professor Mary Davis speaking on Lenin's imperialism and the theory of the labour aristocracy. Mary's talk will be followed by Jonathan White talking about Lenin on the state and revolution. The book that he wrote during the events of June, July in Petrograd. And following Mary and Jonathan, we'll be welcoming our great friend and comrade Vijay Prashad, who'll be joining us online, and we'll be talking about Lenin's What Is to Be Done. These are seminal works, as relevant today, or more relevant today, than even they were in Lenin's day. This is going to be an excellent discussion and debate, and I'm looking forward to hearing your remarks. So, without more ado, I'm going to turn to our first speaker and welcome Miriam Jump, who's our director at the Marx Memorial Library. I would just say to you online or in the room, if you are not yet a member of the Marx Memorial Library, take this opportunity to join us. We are a membership organisation. It's very cheap, and you won't be able to access any of the works that Marion is about to talk about unless you're a member. So please log on, join up by the end of the day, and we look forward to welcoming you as members of this great institution. Marion, over to you.
Thank you very much, Alex. So I'm going to use my kind of 15 to 20 minutes to do three things. Firstly, to highlight this link that Lenin has with our wonderful building at 37A Clerkenwell Green. Then I'll speak a little bit more about Lenin and the Marx Memorial Library and how he's influenced our work over time and how we've remembered the link with our building. And finally, a little bit about our development plans and future plans. Could I have my slides up, please? So many of you will know a lot about the Marx Memorial Library already, but I'll say a few words about who we are and what we do just as an introduction. We're a research and education centre dedicated to Marxism and the history of socialism, now coming into our 10th decade. We were founded in 1933, 9 years after Lenin died, as a Marxist library for the working class movement with a clear educational remit, and that still stands today. This work continues to this day, and we have in this three-storey building over 50,000 volumes on socialism and Marxism, with world-class archives on anti-fascism, movements for colonial liberation and radical press and printing, just to mention a few key themes. We have an ambitious and extensive education and engagement programme, including online courses on Marxism, lectures, launches, marking key anniversaries like this one in our history, as well as workshops with primary, secondary school students, open days, and bespoke sessions for undergraduates as well. We're really proud of our partnerships with trade unions, community and heritage organisations, which we use to deliver our programme, and we produce an annual journal, Theory and Struggle, as well. It's worth mentioning that we're just coming to the end of a really exciting project here at the library, which kicked off in our 90th year last year, funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, which focused on, well, what key element of it was researching the history of our building, and kind of unsurprisingly, they discovered that the link with Lenin is absolutely essential in terms of our historical significance. And they even said that we're the only building in Britain that's intimately associated with Lenin. How you define that, I'm not sure, but we're really proud of the connection. And as Alex said, it was here that he edited Iskra, The Spark, for a period of just over a year, 1902 to 3. So I'll talk about that a little bit later on. So this centenary, 100 years after Lenin's death, surely there's no better place to mark and reflect on this occasion in the only building in the UK with this intimate link with Lenin, and in our research and education centre dedicated to Marxism and socialist history. Can I flick 2 slides forward, actually? Oh no, 1 back, please. So I'm going to start by, I draw heavily, by the way, on the work of Andrew Rothstein, who was previous chair and president of the Marx Memorial Library. Alex has already mentioned Theodore, who had such a critical role to play in Lenin's connection to the library. I'm going to set the scene a little bit by talking about what was going on here in Clerkenwell at this time when Lenin came over to the UK. So Clerkenwell Green was a hub of radical activity and has been for centuries. So it's part of the context. It's where the Peasants' Revolt gathered and where crowds met the Tolbother martyrs when they returned from their period of transportation. Prior to Lenin's time here, we know the International Working Men's Association met here in the 1860s, and indeed the May Day rally gathered on the Green since it started in the 1890s, as it does today. So it was no surprise then that in June 1883, the Social Democratic Federation, Britain's first socialist party, with members including Eleanor Marx and William Morris, moved their printing press, 20th Century Press, from Gray's Inn Road to 37A Clerkenwell Green, with Harry Quelch as editor. For a while, the press was the only real source of cheap socialist literature being produced in this country, and it produced things like 3 to 4 page tracts and longer translations of Marxist texts. It undertook printing for various trade unions and produced translations and speeches and accounts of strikes and disputes at the time. And we hold many of these at the Marx Memorial Library. A lot of them are very attractive thanks to the work of Walter Crane as well. It was here as well that they produced Justice, their newspaper, and we've got all of those digitised online. You'll see a copy up there. The press remained at 37A Clerkenwell Green until 1922, and it's worth noting that it was very well known in international socialist circles. Another part of this broader picture is that during this period, London had a national reputation for free press and the liberal rights to asylum as well. So it's against this backdrop, with a thriving community of political exiles and emigres in London, an internationally renowned socialist press in the hub of radical Clerkenwell, that Lenin came to be here. Andrew Rothstein unpicks the detail of how Lenin came to 37A Clerkenwell Green in his account. In February, March 1902, Martov, who was a leading fellow member of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, wrote to Alexeyev, who was a Russian Marxist resident in London, from Munich, where the Russian Socialist Labour Party, the newspaper Iskra, was being published at the time and had been since 1900. And Martov explained that they needed to move the press to London due to new repressive measures against the press, and he hoped that the Social Democratic Federation would publish it, and asked Alexeyev to raise this with Harry Quelch. So he met Quelch to discuss this, and it was all agreed, providing they provide their own compositors to set up the Cyrillic type. So shortly afterwards, 3 of the 6 members of the editorial board of Iskra made their way to London, with most of them, I think, living on Sidmouth Street. I think Bob can confirm that for me. Lenin arrived in London in April 1902 with his wife Krupskaya, and they set up home in Holford Square. I think in these early weeks, I think we can skip forward, actually. I'm missing those lines. That's Harry Quelch pictured there, and some examples of what was printed on site. In these early weeks, Theodore Rothstein was really critical in setting up arrangements in Clerkenwell Green. So for this period of 12 months, from April 1902 to May 1903, 17 issues of Iskra was produced, numbers 22 to 38. Go to my next slide, please. Iskra, whose masthead loosely translates as "from a spark a flame will flare up," was the first nationally distributed paper of the Russian Social Democrats, and it was the first underground Marxist newspaper to be distributed in Russia. Its purpose was to educate readers in Marxism, expose the tyranny of Tsardom, and agitate workers to overthrow the regime. You'll see when you visit our Lenin room upstairs that we have facsimile copies that was printed on incredibly thin paper, just 4 pages, to facilitate the smuggling back into Russia by agents. Of this period in Clerkenwell Green, Lenin wrote in September 1913 in his obituary notice on Harry Quelch. So Lenin said, 11 years ago, the Russian Social Democratic newspaper had to be printed in London. The British Social Democrats, headed by Quelch, readily made their printing plant available. And as a result, Quelch had to squeeze up. A corner was boarded off in the printing works as a thin partition to serve as an editorial room. And the present writer used to visit Quelch in this editorial office where there was no room for another chair. So that's our Lenin room upstairs. It was in Quelch's room then that Lenin read the proofs of Iskra after the number had been set in a little, we actually don't know where this is, I don't think, in an East End private printing shop by this German compositor, Blumenfeld, who'd been brought over specifically for that purpose. Rothstein also explains that the flatbed machinery, which was kind of lighter machinery, was set up on the first floor, which you'll see when you have a look upstairs, and it was one long room accommodating this machinery. I think lots of questions that we maybe have time to discuss this later can be raised about Lenin's time in London and what impact this would have had on him. I think we know that he found it kind of dirty and expensive when he first arrived, but that he had a fondness for the green spaces, and he spent a lot of time, as we know, at the British Museum, then the British Library, and as well as other public libraries. I think we know that it was Finsbury Library as well. And often forgotten that Krupskaya's played an absolutely critical role, particularly with correspondence with other comrades across Europe and Russia. So the editorial board left for Geneva in May 1903, and Lenin was to return to London a number of times, I think 5 in total. But this first period where he was here at the now Marx Memorial Library was his longest stay and his first stay. I'll end this part of my talk with an anecdote that I think highlights the impact it must have had on him. So Tom Quelch, Harry Quelch's son, who'd been working as a compositor at the press when Lenin came here, 14 years later went to Moscow as a delegate for the British Socialist Party in July 1920 to the Second Congress of the Communist International. And he went to see Lenin at the Kremlin, and Lenin said, "How is everybody at Clerkenwell Green?" So that's rather nice. So next slide, please. So what does this mean for the Marx Memorial Library? Of course, this was a number of years before we were even founded. I'll take you back to our founding year in 1933. So a Marx Commemoration Committee, you'll see the invitation notice up there, was established by a group of socialists, communists and trade unionists. It was 50 years since Marx died, and against the backdrop of the rise of fascism in Europe. And it was agreed that a library and workers' school should be set up. At this first meeting, I think in March in 1933. Shortly after that, Noreen and Clive Branson were tasked, who were leading members of the Communist Party at the time, with finding a premises. And Tom Quelch, who was son of Harry, as we know, he was the one who had worked here, who recommended the then boarded up 20th Century Press, with its very close associations with Lenin, as an appropriate place for our Marxist Library and Education Centre. So arguably, it's why we're here. In 1941, we produce these bulletins every quarter since 1934. Our bulletin in 1941 underlines the importance of this association, saying it's very fitting that a building which possesses such associations should be the headquarters of a national centre for Marxist education. One of our aims is to keep this building within the working class movement. So 90 years, and here's another 90 years. So how have we remembered this important association? Well, we've got our linen room upstairs, which you'll have a chance to see shortly. What we do know about that space, we've been exploring in the past year, looking at the history of our building, that it was a small space boarded up on the first floor. We also know, however, that the 1924 plans for our building, the partition walls that you'll see today, weren't there. These, in fact, feature in the 1933 plans by, I'm not sure I pronounce this correctly,
Chermayev,
yes.
Serge Chermayev.
So it was obviously created as a kind of commemorative space when we were founded. However, for almost 100 years now, hundreds of visitors visit us every year from all over the world to set foot in that small place. We've got a dedication plaque up there. You can see copies of Iskra. And in fact, on the centenary of the revolution, BBC Radio 2 broadcast live from there, describing it as the heart of the revolution. So we've held on to that as well. Another way in which we've remembered Lenin's time in the building, which you can't see right now because of the screen, but you will see shortly. Could I have the next slide, please? Is in 1970 we unveiled a plaque. So 100 years since Lenin's birth, a relief produced by Lawrence Bradshaw, who was also responsible, as many of you know, for Marx's grave at Highgate. The ceremony, there's a detailed description of the ceremony in our bulletin, was attended by a representative from the Academy of Sciences in the USSR, by Anthony Greenwood, the Minister of Housing, and George Gollan, the Secretary of the CP. And Rothstein, who is present obviously as well, observed in the opening of the proceedings that the plaque would commemorate the comradely cooperation of British socialists and those of Russia at the beginning of the century. So it was appropriate that at this unveiling, a representative of the Soviet people should be accompanied by representatives of the two component parts of the British workers' movement. And they count that about 500 visited the exhibition they held as well, which I think that's the picture of the exhibition just up there. Much more recently, in 2017, we had a very ambitious programme marking the centenary of the Russian Revolution, joint with our partners at the Society for Cooperation in Russian and Soviet Studies, and we packed out the TUC with 500 people. Have the next slide, please. There we go. We produced a book and film screenings and all sorts, and welcomed many more school groups into the building as well. As Alex has already said, Lenin's intellectual legacy, not just his role in making history, which we'll hear more about this afternoon, is imprinted throughout our education programme, including our online courses and lectures that you've all got programmes on your seats. In fact, we're running our next iteration of Capitalism, Crisis and Imperialism on the 30th of January. And we know these are still really, really popular. Our best attended online events were during the COVID pandemic, marking 150 years since Lenin's birth by Jonathan White, who's just here. So it's wonderful to see that there's still an appetite to revisit Lenin's work and his significance today. Next slide, please. Our library and artefact collections are also testament to Lenin's impact on revolutionary history and Marxist theory. We've got lots of fantastic visual things like these posters. I like this poster here, we just discovered quite recently, this memorial meeting in 1942. Small library. And we also hold wonderful photographic collection editions from all over the world of Lenin's works. And you'll probably notice if you spend any amount of time in the library, you're never more than a couple of metres away from some kind of representation of Lenin. So I wanted to highlight a couple of items just because it's nice to pick out a couple. When you visit upstairs, when you have a look at the Lenin room, we've got what we call our Sackler-Barla statue. Sackler-Barla was Communist MP for Battersea North in the 1920s, and there's a nice story attached to this artefact. He was on his way home from the Soviet Union after a lecture tour in 1934, and he invited a crew of 40 back to his house in Highgate for tea. I think his family were a little bit overwhelmed. So they received afterwards a reciprocal invitation, and the crew of Russian sailors insisted they took this little statue of Lenin from their Lenin corner and unbolted it. Thankfully, Sackler-Barla's wife decided it'd be better kept here at the Monksmoor Library. Have another slide, please. A couple of other items. It's just a nice story of this is. I'm ending with a kind of fundraiser actually, but we've got a wonderful ceramic collection, including this Soviet ceramic from 1922 that was broken, obviously, in its past life. And as part of the centenary celebrations in 2017, we launched an appeal and got funding for actually quite a substantial amount of money to do this kind of stuff professionally from the Indian Workers Association. So you'll see it's quite phenomenal. You cannot see it's broken at all when you visit upstairs. And we've also got our Dimitrov's coat, which was actually present at Lenin's funeral in Moscow in January 1924. Many of you may know this story, but I'm going to tell it again with a pitch for some funds. So it's a very unique item, and it's significant because of the kind of bizarre story behind it. So Harry Pollitt, who was obviously later General Secretary of the Communist Party, was in Moscow. And during that time, Lenin passed away, and Pollitt attended his funeral. And obviously, it was a bit cold in Moscow in January. So Dimitrov, who later became the Communist International, so led the Communist International from 1934 to 43, lent him this coat, and then said, "Oh, will turn it to me when you next come to Moscow." 12 years later, in 1936, Sam Lesser, who went to join the International Brigades in Spain via a trip to Moscow and thought, well, I'll take the coat back. Pollitt just encouraged him to take this coat back. And Dimitrov said, well, just keep it. I've got coats. It's fine. And then the coat went with Russell to Spain. He tried to return it to Pollitt, and Pollitt said, no, I've got one as well. So basically Sam Russell ended up with his coat. And when he passed away, we got his archives back to Spain and the coat. But the coat has been obviously sat on this kind of mannequin for decades. And we've had professional conservators and carried to look at it, and it's just falling apart. It's been eaten by various bugs, and it's not a happy coat, really. And we know that the story, it's a fascinating story. It relates to Lenin's time in this building as well, and Spain and all sorts. So we need £3,000 to completely conserve it, to make sure it's hung somewhere where it can be here for decades to come, and put in a display case. So Ralph will be standing here with a card reader for the rest of the day, encouraging you to part with your cash. Right. Finally, I'm going to. I think that's my last slide, isn't it? But just to say a few words about the ways in which Lenin's legacy at the library plays a part in our future plans. As I mentioned, we're exploring lots of. Well, I've mentioned that we did a big investigative project last year on our 90th birthday, looking into our building, our collections, our audiences, and what we can do into the future. And a key part of that is that we envisage arriving at our centenary year in 9 years' time with a redeveloped building which is properly accessible, which with a broad education and engagement programme, and critically with an exhibition space down here on the ground floor. So it's properly a welcoming space. And obviously a key part of that is telling Lenin's story in this historic building. So we're really excited about being able to revisit how we do that best for all sorts of visitors. And so, as I said, if you could fill in the survey that you've got in your packs once you hit the Lenin room. I mean, we're also looking at, as you may have noticed as you arrived, that there's been lots of development work. Well, you might not because of the filming, but there's been lots of development work on Clerkenwell Green. The council are sprucing the whole area up, and there's a movement to make sure that the radical history of the Green is a really key part of that. So we're there making sure that Lenin and his story here is part of the history that's told as part of all the council's development. And finally, Lenin's thinking resonates throughout lots of our collections on anti-imperialism, on revolution, on peace, on the organisation of the working classes. And we've been combing through our archive collections, bringing together thematic guides on these subjects so we can make them available to students of all different ages. So yeah, I think that's it from me. But join, sign up. Let's go.
Thank you, Marion. And I'm sure that's prompted a lot of questions and ideas about various historical connections between Lenin and some of the other really important personalities who've come through this building and have lived in London. We'll take your comments and questions after the next speaker, because I think the next speaker will add very nicely to the context that Marion has been talking about. Marion has mentioned briefly in passing Walter Crane, the illustrator who illustrated much of the early socialist and trade union movements, posters, membership cards, banners, stained glass windows. Walter Crane lived in Argyle Square, just next to King's Cross Station, only literally just over a stone's throw from Lenin's first habitation, the first place that he and Krupskaya came to live in London, the area that became known as Little Russia. If you want to know what it was like, I'd really recommend reading Krupskaya's My Life with Lenin, which has a wonderful chapter about their life in London and talks in great detail about his impressions of London, their impressions of London, their work in the underground work they were doing, in particular, the important work that she did in the Iskra Group, which was to keep the records of all of the Iskra Group's agents throughout the world, because these newspapers had to be, the Iskra had to be distributed through the most complex underground networks. And the agents who received the newspapers in various far-flung cities, Alexandria, in Persia, throughout Europe and within the Tsarist Empire, would forward it then on to others. But they were also journalists and reporters in their own right. So they wrote reports for the newspaper and for the Iskra Group. It was an incredible network, and the existence of the network was being tracked very closely by the Tsarist secret police. And it was her job, Krupskaya, to keep the records in codified form, so that if the police found the records of the Iskra Group, they wouldn't be able to crack the code. She's an incredible person, and I think it's a big part of the story of Lenin in London, reading what she had to say about their time here. So I'd encourage you to read it. But I'm going to turn now to our next speaker, who is Bob Henderson, who is the author, as I said earlier, of Lenin in London, The Spark That Lit the Revolution. And I'm going to ask him to enlarge on what Marion has just said. Over to you, Bob.
Well, thanks very much to Marion and Alex for the invitation to speak today. It's a real pleasure to have the opportunity to appear in person for the first time in goodness knows how long. And I'm going to start with the first slide, showing an image of the man himself, Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, alongside... Sorry. This is Lenin alongside Mayakovsky's famous aphorism. That's it. Lenin lived, Lenin lives, Lenin will always live. In my short presentation today, I intend to concentrate only on the first part of that aphorism and describe some lesser-known historical facts about how Lenin lived during his visits to London in the first decade of the 20th century. Back a wee bit, yeah. I'm sure the topics of his current and future relevance to Britain and the world will be adequately covered by later speakers, and no doubt by historians, academics and others in the course of this centennial year. I'm delighted today to be able to renew my association with the Marx Library, which I first visited way back in the 80s, shortly after starting my job as a Russian curator at the British Museum Library. I was fascinated then by the Lenin Room and by what I learned about the institution's other links with the Russian revolutionary movement. When preparing for this talk, I was reminded that a few years after my visit, I got in touch with the library again to pass on news of a discovery I'd just made at the museum. And I'll say more on that shortly, for it was that discovery that really sparked my interest, so to speak, in London's Russian revolutionary associations, and which led to the publication of my latest book, The Spark That Lit the Revolution. That's it. But even, one reviewer assumed that the book was a rewrite of my PhD, but in fact it's a commissioned work based on my 30-odd years of research into Lenin and the Russian political emigration. Now, Lenin's life has been documented in more detail than perhaps any other historical figure. I've lost count of the number of biographies of the man that have appeared since his death. And just about every biographer of recent times has made heavy use of the impressive 13-volume biographical chronicle, next slide, compiled by the Institute of Marxism-Leninism over a 15-year period. But even that meticulously compiled work is not exhaustive. For example, comparatively little is to be found there about the 6 visits Lenin made to London between 1902 and 1911. Fortunately, over the years, I've been able to make quite a few archival discoveries that throw more light on both the political and private life of the man during that period. And I'd like to concentrate on just a few of these today in the time I've got. First, I'd like to say a few words about how my interest in Lenin and the emigration began. It all kicked off 30 years ago in the archives of the British Museum, where I was lucky enough to discover a previously unknown set of letters relating to Lenin's 1908 admission to the library. The library already possessed correspondence relating to his first admission in 1902 under the name Dr. Jakob Richter. But despite numerous attempts by archivists and other visiting scholars, no trace had been uncovered about his later visits. I managed to make my little breakthrough quite simply by comparing the various transliteration systems which existed. That is, the different ways in which countries around the world chose to transpose the Cyrillic into the Latin alphabet. Leafing through a volume of Lenin's correspondence, I came across a letter he'd written in the early 1900s, in which he'd signed off using a continental Latinized form of his real name, Vladimir Ulyanov. This name would have been transcribed, according to the British Museum, as Ulyanov with a U, whereas using the continental Latinized form, you get Ulyanov OU. And so the archivist was dispatched to search his admissions registers again under that letter of the alphabet, and a few minutes later returned with a little packet of correspondence tied up with a delicate pink ribbon and gave me the honour of opening it. What I found inside was not one, but 2 letters from Vladimir Ilyich to the director of the museum. That discovery sparked some press interest, but happy though I was with the newspaper coverage, that was as nothing compared to the absolute thrill of the moment of discovery itself. To be the first person in almost 80 years to hold these unique documents in my hand and to read Lenin's words written in his own neat handwriting seemed to bring the man back to life. And if you'll bear with me, I'll try to show you one of these letters. Next slide. So it really was a case of Lenin lives. This is the original photograph of one of those historical documents as supplied to me by the Museum Reprographic Authority section. I'm not sure how legible it will be to you, so let me read it out. Dear Sir, I am writer by profession. I have sent to the British Museum from Geneva, where I am usually living, 2 of my Russian books. My pen name is Ilin. I came now in London in order to study comparatively new English and new German philosophy. I enclose a written recommendation from a London householder, and I should be very much obliged if you would give me admission tickets to the reading room of the British Museum. Signed, Vladimir Ulyanov, 21 Tavistock Place. So this was part of my great discovery. All in all, a fairly bland letter at first glance, but it does contain some interesting elements. For example, the reference to the London householder, who had acted as his referee. And this is where a couple of Marx Library connections come into play. The gentleman in question signed his testimonial under the name of J.J. Terrett, and in all of the voluminous biographical information that has been compiled on Lenin, nowhere is this name to be found. Initially, I couldn't find much about this mysterious individual, and so I wrote to Andrew Rothstein, former secretary of the Marx Library, who quickly got back to me, and here's a copy of that letter. And this, I'm happy to say, this and the other related letters, I'm delighted today to present to the Marx Library to add to their excellent Rothstein collection. The letter and one that followed contain lots of fascinating information, including the quite remarkable fact that Rothstein personally remembered Joe Terrett, as he was known, as an active organiser in the Social Democratic Federation and also as a particularly violent anti-German propagandist at the outbreak of war. What's more, Terrett wrote the occasional article for Justice and also had a pamphlet published by the 20th Century Press. I'd like to look through the collections and dig them out later on. Just how he ended up acting as a referee for Vladimir Ilyich is difficult to say, but I assume that when Lenin arrived in London, he would have made a beeline for Clerkenwell Green to ask his comrade of 6 years, Harry Quelch, if he could help him regain admission to the museum. I can only guess that Quelch wasn't available, but that Joe Terrett happened to be in the building at the time and offered up his services. As it turned out, the museum rejected Terrett's recommendation, and so Lenin had to hurry back to Clerkenwell Green to get another letter, this time from Quelch, which I'm fairly certain Lenin delivered personally to the museum authorities, and which they thankfully accepted, allowing him to begin his researches, which would result a year later in the publication of his famous book, Materialism and Imperial Criticism. This is just one of the many unrecorded episodes from Lenin's life in London. But it's quite an unusual one, for it involved him in having dealings with not one, but 2 Englishmen. It's known that during most of his stays, Lenin kept himself pretty much to himself. Most of his time would be spent either in his little office here, or at the British Museum. He would meet up only occasionally with those other émigrés associated with the newspaper Iskra, but as far as the natives were concerned, he avoided contact whenever possible. He also had little to do with those of his compatriots who had settled in London before his arrival, although there are 2 very important exceptions to this rule. When they first arrived in London, Lenin and Krupskaya were conveyed immediately to a flat at number 20 Regent Square, near King's Cross. During the war, the square suffered extensive bomb damage, but fortunately, the southern side, pictured here, survived relatively unscathed, as did the gardens themselves, with their dozen or so majestic London plane trees. And here it was that they were introduced to a young émigré couple that they'd first met some 10 years earlier in St. Petersburg. On their arrival in London in 1899, that couple had adopted the pseudonyms of Robert and Paulina Tarr. Now, I make no apologies for the space I devote to the Tarrs in my book, or to give them the real names, Konstantin Takhtariev and his wife Apollinaria Yakubova. Their relationship to Lenin during that 1902 to 03 period was so intense and intimate, it's quite surprising that till now it's hardly received a mention in the literature. This is probably because during the post-revolutionary period, the couple had been virtually written out of the official history books. And this, despite the fact that in the 90s, Yakubova had been a founding member, together with Lenin, of a small revolutionary circle, which eventually grew to become the RSDLP. The eradication of their memory was so complete that historians were not sure even what the young revolutionary had looked like. For a long time, it was thought that no photograph of her had survived. Fortunately, a few years ago in the Russian archives, I managed to find not one, but 2. And here's one of her alongside her beloved husband. This one, I think, they were both taken about the 1890s, still very young looking there. So, now, Takhtariev and Yakubova helped the new arrivals in so many ways, one does indeed wonder if they could have survived London without them. Krupskaya does briefly allude to their intimacy, recalling that during the period she and Lenin were constant visitors. They were there все время, all the time, to the Takhtariev's flat. Not only did they help Dr. Richter and his wife find their first lodgings in nearby Holford Square, they also acted as interpreters and helped Lenin set up production of his newspaper in Clerkenwell Green. I think it may have been Takhtariev who introduced Rothstein to Lenin, but I could be wrong, to Quelch. Moreover, Krupskaya also mentioned that it was Takhtariev who was responsible for the organisation of the famous Second Party Congress in London in 1903. And it's testament to his meticulous planning that to this day, the exact locations of the Congress meetings remain unknown. Sadly, due to political or perhaps personal difficulties, Lenin's friendship with the couple had ended before he next arrived in London, some 2 years later, to attend the third 1905 Congress. It was therefore necessary to put someone else in charge of the organisation, so as to again safeguard the delegates' privacy. It's often been claimed that Lenin had the uncanny ability to move effortlessly and invisibly around Europe without attracting any attention at all, and this Congress is often cited as proof of that skill. All that was known about the event was Lenin's address at 16 Percy Circus, and also the location of the first session of the Congress, which was held in a nearby pub, the Crown and Woolpack, up at the Angel Islington. The venue was in a room on the first floor, and it would have been accessed by that door on the right on Owen Street, which I'll mention in a minute. It was here that an intrepid young special branch detective claimed to have hidden in a cupboard while that first meeting was going on. But that was not all that was known about this event. That was all that was known about this event, which attracted around 30 delegates and which ran for 3 weeks. So you might think, a pretty effective piece of secret planning by the Bolsheviks. But you'd be wrong. For quite apart from the young lad from Special Branch, there was another, somewhat more experienced agent lurking in the background, whose file I unearthed in the archives of the Hoover Institution at Stanford University a few years back. This agent would later report to his masters in Paris that on the very morning of that first session, an unidentified man was spotted leaving the house of a well-known Russian revolutionary out in Hammersmith. The man had been tailed all the way to the Angel. There, at the door of the Crown and Woolpack, he had been admitted to an upstairs room by 2 well-known London émigrés who were standing guard. From that day on, the agent filed a meticulous set of reports covering the movements of the revolutionaries over the entire period, and not only pinpointed the 5 other locations where the sessions took place, but also managed to find out the addresses of almost all of the participants. This individual was a Frenchman who went by the delightful name of Monsieur Jean-Edgar Farce, who for several years already had served as the Russian Secret Police's man in London. And I describe his tragic fate in some detail in the book. Now here we have an artistic representation of one of the Congress sessions. Now the artist may well have based this illustration on that first session at the Crown and Woolpack, but I like to think that it's of one of the later sessions, which took place in the Hare and Hounds pub, situated just past Islington Town Hall on Upper Street. Although that pub's undergone a series of name changes, it can still be easily identified by the frieze on the second floor wall, which depicts a beleaguered hare pursued by a pack of threatening hunting dogs. And here's a recent photograph I took. That one, yeah. And here's an image of what the pub would have looked like in Lenin's time. Next one. Minus the van. And that room below the frieze is where I envisage Lenin holding forth to a rapt audience. It's difficult to think of a more fitting location and image, bearing in mind that not only the Russian and British political police, but also the French Sûreté had taken on the role of bloodhound and were all intent in hunting down and destroying the Russian revolutionary movement in its infancy. But let's now quickly move on to Lenin's next visit, which took place 2 years later, when he arrived as one of the 350-odd delegates at the famous 5th London Congress. This, the 1907 Congress, was about as far removed from the 1905 as you could get. The delegates had come from all over Russia, from all the major European centres of emigration. The intention had been to hold the Congress in Copenhagen, but permission had been refused at the last minute by the Danish authorities, and so they were obliged quickly to seek out another venue. When they eventually started to arrive in London in mid-May, it was evident that this time there was little chance of their proceedings being conducted in secrecy. And I do apologise for the poor quality of this slide, which was taken from the Daily Mail. As you can see, I hope, the press reporters and photographers were out in force and pestered the delegates mercilessly on a daily basis outside the location of the Congress, which was held somewhat oddly in a church on Southgate Road in North London. What was rather curious about the event was that, despite the massive press presence, no one seemed to know where this huge delegation actually lived during these 3 weeks. It's not easy to find accommodation in London at the best of times, but how do you house over 300 individuals at short notice? Moreover, the Copenhagen fiasco had severely impacted party finances, so they had to find somewhere that was both cheap and as near as possible to the Congress venue to save on time and, more importantly, money. I'm fairly sure that I've now managed to solve that mystery and track down the place, and I'd like to show you it here. It's an old map dating from the 1890s. So over here on the left, you'll see that little black blob there is the Brotherhood Church, whereas over here on the right, you might just be able to make out a barracks. Right, I'll get back to it. I came across a memoir left by one of the women delegates at the Congress in which she expressed her indignity and indeed anger at the accommodation which the English authorities had offered them. She recalled that it was some dismal, disused army barracks, and I'm pretty sure that what she had in mind was this building here on the west side of London Fields in Dalston. The barracks, which could accommodate up to 500 men, had served as the headquarters of the 7th Battalion of the Rifle Brigade until they relocated in September 1904 to the north of London. The building's long since gone, but I went out there some time ago to try to retrace the delegates' daily journey to Southgate Road and back. I'm fairly sure they would have been obliged to make the journey on foot. So they would have come down Shrubland Road to the Regent's Canal and walked along the towpath there for about 10-15 minutes until they got to the Brotherhood Church. It's difficult now to imagine the spectacle of hundreds of exotic bearded Russians trudging alongside the canal and back for 3 whole weeks. Goodness only knows what the local residents must have made of it. But as I say, there is no mention of it in any press report I've come across so far. And there's yet another mystery concerning the Congress, which I think I've now managed to solve. Unfortunately, I only cracked it after my book had been published, so you're hearing it about it here for the first time. Now, all of Lenin's addresses during his 6 visits to London had been documented, with the exception of this all-important 1907 visit. In the past, the address has been variously and wrongly given as Kingston Square and, bizarrely, Kensington Square, which was suggested by Simon Sebag Montefiore in his biography. Perhaps the best source of information on Lenin's movements during and immediately after the Congress is the memoir of his stenographer, a certain Karzhansky, who, once proceedings had ended, spent a week with Lenin transcribing and editing the latter's contributions. He describes how he presented himself at Lenin's lodgings on the first morning after proceedings had finished. The building, he said, was an ordinary London suburban house, from the doorstep of which a clock tower was visible in the distance. And at the appointed hour, when he saw the hands of the clock reach 8, he knocked on the door and was greeted by Lenin himself. I'm fairly sure that the clock tower referred to by Karzhansky is that of St Clement's, formerly St Barnabas Church, which stands on the eastern edge of King Square, Islington, not Kingston Square, nor indeed Kensington Square. Most of the neighbouring buildings were either destroyed during the war or demolished at a later date. But fortunately, London Metropolitan Archive holds a few old photographs of this square dating from 1945. And here's one, you see, on the west side looking southwest. And it's possible, maybe even likely, that Lenin would have lived in one of the houses on this side, facing as they do directly over to the clock tower on the far side. And here's another one, which we'd quickly look at and then just skip on. Okay. Now, if I bring up another old map, I can show you in more detail how Lenin would have journeyed to the Congress venue every day. That's it. So you can see King Square picked out in red here. All Lenin would have had to do to get to the Congress would be to cross Old Street, head north up to the Regent's Canal, cross over the bridge and walk back a few minutes till he reached Southgate Road in the church. A journey of no more than 20 to 25 minutes. By the way, you can probably also see how close King Square is to his old haunts at Angel Islington and also his former residencies in Percy Circus and Holford Square over to the left there. So we've already covered Lenin's penultimate visit to the library in 1908, so let's finish quickly with a few words about his final flying visit in 1911. In October of that year, Lenin had embarked on a tour of Europe, delivering a lecture entitled Stolypin and Revolution, and one of his final ports of call was London, where he took lodgings in yet another leafy square, this time at 6 Oakley Square in North Camden. A few days later, on the 11th of November, he delivered his lecture at the new King's Hall on the Commercial Road in Whitechapel. This huge hall, now demolished, had been converted into a 200-seat cinema a few years earlier. But sadly, absolutely nothing is known about Lenin's lecture. To the best of my knowledge, there were no reviews, and so we're completely in the dark as to how many were present or how it was received. We do know, however, that he did manage to pay a final brief visit to the museum, and there encountered an old comrade, the German socialist Max Beer. By the end of the month, he was already back with Krupskaya in Paris. So Lenin had arrived in Britain for the first time in 1902, and now, 9 years later, had left never to return. One can't help but wonder what impressions the country and the capital had made on him over these years. As detailed in the reminiscences of his colleagues and of his wife, Lenin, long before his arrival, had of course formed firm opinions on the inequities of such bourgeois capitalist conurbations as London, the yawning divide between rich and poor, the two nations that he brought to the attention of Trotsky and others. His various visits, I believe, merely served to reinforce these pre-existing views. Max Beer would later make an interesting, perhaps appropriate comparison. To him, Lenin was a socialist Peter the Great, who took from Western learning just as much as he needed for the transformation of Russia. And though living and studying for years in Central and Western Europe, and admiring much of what he'd found there, his heart and his spirit would always reside in his Russian land, in the midst of its workers and peasants. And I think I'll stop there and just thank you for your attention.
Okay, if that hasn't piqued your interest and your appetite, I don't know what will. We've got, I don't know how many people online at the moment, Suzanne. 48 people online. I don't know if there are any questions in the chat there. We'll come to that in a minute. Is there anyone in the room who wants to ask our two speakers a question? I'll take the comrade in the middle there. Yes, you. In fact, sorry, just to be awkward about this, would you mind just coming down so you can speak into the mic, because then people online can hear you? Thank you so much. And if you want to, you can just introduce yourself and say who you are, but you don't feel necessary.
Okay, so just a question. There's this often repeated statement that Lenin spoke English with an Irish accent. I'm not sure if it's true or not, because like his tutor was Irish. So could you speak about the fluency of Lenin in English, if he had any opinions about the language, or like what was the extent of his interaction with the English language itself? Thank you.
Okay. Anyone else wants to ask any questions about Lenin in the library, the collection, or indeed in London? Have we got anything in the chat there, Suzanne? Well, in that case, let's go to, I don't know if you want to respond to that.
Yes,
Bob?
certainly. I think the story about his understanding Irish better was described by Krupskaya, I think, in our memoir. In terms of his English, I think it's often said that he had great command, but as you'll see by the letter there were some halting mistakes, grammatical and other mistakes. When he first arrived in 1902, he, of course, got lessons in English from 3 different people. And so I think at that time, his command was improving slowly. But by the time he was applying in 1908, he'd hardly had the need to speak English. And so I think that would explain some of his faults. Prior to arriving in London, while in exile in Siberia, he'd apparently translated, I can't remember what the work was now, a famous English book anyway, but he couldn't do it because the English was too difficult, and so he had to go he translated from the German translation into Russian. Can't remember the name now, so it's in the book. So I don't think his command of English was as good as some people have tried to make out.
And wasn't there some connection with Rory Connolly, James Connolly's son, and a meeting who met Lenin, and he was the one who said, "But you're speaking with an Irish accent." Anyone else want to come in here? Yes, we've got somebody online.
Sorry for my naive question. I wonder if you may know any episode which may reveal Lenin's personality, e.g. he might have tried to explore a tunnel underground at the Ivory Building.
I don't know if people heard that, but there's a question online about whether Robert presumably has managed to divine any clues about Lenin's personality, particularly in relation to
tunnel finding.
Well, just very quickly, I think that's a really good question actually, because there are so many anecdotes about Marx in London and about his personality that people have written plays about Marx in London, and I don't think we have a similar sort of sense of Lenin in that way.
Yeah.
I mean, is that because he was a less extroverted and personality, or?
That's right. I think, as I mentioned, he didn't go about much with the natives, if you like. Although people sometimes talk of him as quite a stern character, no sense of humour, and that's counteracted by some episodes I describe in the book by Takhtariev, who spent a lot of time with him, despite the fact that he was actually of a Menshevik persuasion. So the link there is interesting. But Takhtariev told regularly about how witty he was, how he liked to laugh, and there's also instances in the book where, with his interpreter, his stenographer, who mistyped something, and it sent Lenin into paroxysms of laughter from which he couldn't recover. So there's that kind of aspect. As for digging underneath the British Museum, that's a new one on me.
I mean, there's a great story in your book, Robert, about I think it's the 1907 Congress and an after Congress social where they went to an anarchist club in the East End, whereupon the police were called. Would you like to just
if I can remember?
Unpack it?
That's right. I think the police were called because someone was accused of being a Russian spy, and they all gathered round them, and a whole group of them were arrested by the police, who just happened to be outside, I think, and taken off to the cells. Lenin was one of those who was identified by somebody because he was a small man smoking a cigarette. Now, I don't think in his life he ever smoked a cigarette, pipe or anything, so that's a bit uncertain. But the story goes that on the way there, the Russian spies made themselves known to the police. They were released, and so was everybody else, on the arrival of Prince Kropotkin, who vouched for Lenin, and on that basis they freed him. I don't really know if there's much truth in that at all, does it?
Well, it comes from a police report, so it's probably completely inaccurate. If there's no one who wants to, yes.
Did Lenin and Stalin stay in Rowton House in Stepney?
Yes, Stalin did, and was appalled by the quality of the accommodation, and moved within 2 days. I think he insisted that they be found new accommodation. Now, interestingly, that was a a newly built council workhouse, kind of a working man's dwelling.
A spike.
A spike, yeah. And one of the other ones, in fact, was in south of the river, in somewhere near Bermondsey, I believe. And interesting enough, in 1907, I think there's a picture of it in the book as well, a section of the Menshevik delegation spent the first 2 or 3 days there and had their own little mini conference, and they were very impressed indeed by the quality of this spike. So I suppose spikes differ, but that's it.
Okay.
Menshevik martial explosives.
The housing question, yeah. Okay, so look, I don't know if you wanted to come back on anything, Marion. No. Well, let me just say, therefore, we do have another question. Yes. Would you mind just hold on a second? Thank you so much, David. Yes.
Might I ask if you mentioned very early on that the building's associated with Karl Marx as well, and you said, well, I think you said one of the few buildings where they both stepped in. Could you say a bit more about when Marx was here, please?
Do you want to, Alex? I think
Well,
sorry to pass this on, but I think we all...
yeah, I mean, the building is associated with Marx. It's associated with Eleanor Marx and Karl Marx. But we believe, so in 1860, Marx comes to London in 1848. 1863, there's a big building workers' strike in London while Marx is working in the British Library on Volume 1 of Capital. It leads to the London Trades Council, the trade union councils of London, calling a mass meeting of workers in Covent Garden or near Covent Garden. And at that meeting, the first International Working Men's Association, the First International, was declared. And the significance of the meeting was that the building employers in the strike had brought in workers from Belgium and France to break the strike in London. And so the London Trades Council invited trade unions from London and representatives of workers' organisations from France, Belgium, Germany, Poland, Italy, to form an international. It was an anti-scabbing international. It was about international solidarity between organised labour. And the General Committee, which was elected at that meeting, the General Committee of the First International, was composed half of British trade unionists, representatives of British trade unions, and half of representatives of foreign workers' organisations. And the representative of the German workers' organisation who was elected to the General Committee was Karl Marx. Now, Marx attended meetings of the General Committee. There were lots of doctrinal disputes, and we believe that he gave 2 lectures here. In 1864, he confronted a proposition from an English trade unionist known as Citizen Weston. And Citizen Weston had proposed that the First International should not support any strikes by workers which sought an increase in wages. And the reason for that was that he was a believer in this fallacy known as the iron law of wages, which was propagated. It was the economic orthodoxy of the time, propagated by John Stuart Mill and others. And it was that there was a fixed amount of money in the economy at any one time, and that if one worker gained, another would lose. It's the same sort of thing that George Osborne and Jeremy Hunt and various other people come out with today. And Marx refuted that fallacy in 2 lectures to the General Committee of the First International. We believe it was here, and it was published after his death in a pamphlet known as Value, Price and Profit, which is sometimes more popularly known as Wages, Price and Profit. It's a sort of distillation of his work at the time on Capital, Volume 1, and it shows the relationship between labour power, wage earning, profits, and inflation, price increases. So it's a really interesting little pamphlet. One more online.
We know the article in which Lenin in 1911 harshly attacked Feynman almost with contempt. I would like to know if the two actually met during Lenin's presence in London.
Oh, this is a very good question, because in Robert's presentation, I'll repeat it so that people at the back can hear. The question was, as I think Suzanne said, that we know about Lenin's contempt for Hindman, H.M. Hindman, who was the leader of the Social Democratic Federation and was a pro-imperialist and a chauvinist, which I think is a very interesting point, because Robert has talked about Turret and the connection between the introduction of Lenin to this building through this fellow Turret, who was an anti-German chauvinist. So would you like to just respond to that question?
Yes, I think almost certainly they didn't meet. There was a meeting organised by the SDF in Holborn Town Hall a day or so before the 5th Congress ended. At that meeting, there was a large delegation from the Russian people who attended the Congress, went along and were entertained by the Social Democrats with wine, beer, dancing and whatever. Lenin was not present, and he tended to avoid any kind of meetings outside the Congress itself. So I don't think he would have met Hindman there. It may be that on another occasion he did. I don't think Hindman actually attended any of the sessions of the 1907 Congress. He wasn't a guest. He wasn't an invited guest. There were about 50 guests in total. One of whom was actually Ramsay MacDonald. His relationship to that is still to be uncovered, because I think he may have had a lot more to do with that Congress than people know at present. I'm just working on that at the moment. But as for Hindman, I'm not sure. I don't think the two ever met.
And look, I mean, I think the reason that question is so interesting as we approach the lunch break is that this afternoon our final speaker is going to be Vijay Prashad. And Vijay Prashad is going to be talking about what is to be done. The significance of what is to be done is that it relates to the interventions by Theodore Rothstein, the man who Lenin contacted when he came to London and who was a member of the SDF, and with whom, Lenin had a close political relationship. Rothstein finally became the Soviet ambassador to Tehran in the 1920s. And the reason it's important is that what is to be done illustrates the politics and the political arguments going on in the British Social Democratic Federation against these opportunist and chauvinist positions of its leader, Hindman, who was a former Tory who announced that he'd become a Social Democrat. And this is particularly relevant to the period just after the Boer War. The Boer War was the polarising moment in that Edwardian, late Victorian, early Edwardian period over the question of imperialism, and Theodore Rothstein argued against Hindman inside the SDF for an organised political presence in the trade unions to politically mobilise workers to oppose imperialism and build wider social alliances. So this is a very neat way of segueing into this afternoon's discussion.